December 1939. Yokosuka Naval Arsenal, Japan. The winter air bites through the steel ribs of an unfinished hull. Sparks fall from the torches like orange snow. Beneath the half-lit gantry, a name is stenciled on the frame, Shokaku. Her decks are still bare, but every strike of the hammer echoes with purpose. Japan's naval future is being forged, one carrier at a time. Across the Pacific, the world is quieter. The United States still lives in peacetime rhythm. Christmas lights, factories making cars, radios playing swing. Yet, in the dry docks of Newport News and Brooklyn, engineers run their fingers along blueprints that will soon become Essex-class carriers. Machines not of elegance, but of endurance. No one knows it yet, but in less than 6 years, these two visions of warfare, Japan's precision-built fleet and America's industrial tidal wave, will collide across the world's largest ocean. The outcome will not be decided by admirals or aces, but by rivets, welds, and the unending rhythm of assembly lines. The Pacific was about to become an ocean of carriers. At the turn of 1940, the Imperial Japanese Navy stood as the most technically advanced naval force in the Pacific. Its ships were sleek, efficient, and commanded by officers shaped by a doctrine that worshipped precision and initiative. Yet beneath that brilliance was a fatal constraint, the limits of an island empire. Japan had no vast steel belt, no endless oil fields, no sprawling industrial base. Its resources came from distant colonies and vulnerable sea lanes. Every ship that slipped into the water was the product of scarcity, months of planning, rationed steel, and workforce exhaustion. When Shokaku and Zuikaku were laid down, they were not just ships. They were symbols of national endurance. The Imperial Navy's faith lay in mastery, not mass. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto believed that technology and tactical skill could compensate for industrial inferiority. He envisioned a decisive battle doctrine, a single overwhelming engagement that would shatter the American Pacific Fleet before its industrial might could awaken. To achieve that, Japan placed its future on 6 fleet carriers: Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, Hiryu, Shokaku, and Zuikaku. Each was a marvel. Streamlined hulls, cutting-edge arrestor systems, and air wings trained to perfection. Their crews drilled endlessly in precision strikes, coordination, and range operations. Japan became the first nation to treat the aircraft carrier not as an auxiliary ship, but as the centerpiece of naval power. This thinking led directly to Pearl Harbor. By late 1941, Japan's naval aviation was the finest in the world. Its pilots had more flight hours, its ships carried superior torpedoes, and its doctrine of long-range carrier assaults was unchallenged. The empire believed it could win through speed, destroy the American fleet before the industrial machine across the ocean could respond. But the scale of what America could build was beyond Japan's comprehension. When Japanese planners calculated the expected duration of war, they envisioned perhaps 2 years of supremacy, enough to force Washington to negotiate. Their strategy was front-loaded, strike hard, hold territory, fortify the perimeter, and defend until exhaustion set in on the enemy's side. The entire plan depended on the assumption that America's shipbuilding and aircraft production could not match Japan's in time. They were wrong. The United States had already begun preparing in quiet. The Two-Ocean Navy Act of 1940 authorized a massive naval expansion, a law born before Pearl Harbor was even attacked. It called for hundreds of new warships, including dozens of aircraft carriers. Industrial America, still emerging from the Great Depression, was about to become the largest factory complex in human history. Japan built its carriers in shipyards where every rivet was counted. The US would build them in parallel assembly, multiple hulls laid down side by side, archaias, trained like soldiers, shifts running through the night. For Japan, each carrier was a handcrafted weapon. For America, it became a repeatable blueprint. The contrast was philosophical. Japan's naval elite measured quality in precision. The Americans measured victory in volume. Japan and minorities. Every rivet, every weld, every blueprint carried the same quiet message: build until the ocean is ours again. In Japan, the same event triggered a paradox. The empire had achieved its greatest naval victory and sealed its long-term defeat. The attack that crippled America's battleships also removed the illusion that war could be avoided. The United States would now fight with everything it could make. From 1942 onward, Japanese intelligence began tracking ship production numbers. The reports were grim. American output doubled, then tripled, then broke into numbers so high they stopped sending full reports. Japan could produce 6 carriers in 3 years. The US could build that many in half the time and still have steel left for destroyers, cruisers, and submarines. Every day that passed, the Pacific tilted a little further toward the industrial giant. Yet Japan refused to yield. Its navy refined tactics, trained elite pilots, and continued to strike with precision. For a brief window, skill and strategy still held the balance. The Imperial Navy's finest hour was approaching, an hour built not in a factory, but in the minds of men who believed one perfect strike could still change the war. The carriers were built. The fleets were ready. The ocean was waiting for its reckoning. The Pacific War was not simply fought between 2 fleets, it was fought between 2 philosophies of warfare: precision versus production, craftsmanship versus mass engineering, the few against the many. Beneath that clash of machines lay deeper angles, tactical, technological, and human. Japan entered the war with a doctrine that was years ahead of its rivals. While most nations still believed in the supremacy of battleships, Japan had already evolved. It trained its carrier divisions to operate in tight, coordinated groups, a concept known as the Kido Butai, or mobile striking force. 6 fleet carriers moved as one, their decks a synchronized ballet of aircraft and crew. Each launch cycle was rehearsed with military precision. Torpedo bombers first, dive bombers next, then the protective fighters above. It was a choreography of destruction, perfected through relentless training in peacetime. At Pearl Harbor, this doctrine achieved its purest form. Japanese carriers struck from 230 miles north of Oahu, launching waves of aircraft with exact timing and radio silence. The attack crippled the American Pacific Fleet before a single Japanese sailor saw his enemy face to face. No other navy on Earth could have executed such a complex operation in 1941. Not Britain, not America, only Japan. But brilliance has a limit when built on scarcity. The same precision that made the Japanese carrier force formidable also made it fragile. Every skilled pilot lost was irreplaceable. Every ship damaged meant months of halted progress. America, by contrast, adapted quickly. The US Navy began experimenting with task forces, flexible carrier groups that could strike independently or converge for mass assaults. Instead of one perfect strike, the Americans preferred overlapping blows, supported by radar coordination and ever-expanding logistical chains. By 1942, tactics that had once seemed improvised at Coral Sea and Midway evolved into a system. American carrier warfare became an ecosystem, pilots, intelligence, engineers, and oilers moving in coordinated harmony. The Japanese had pioneered the carrier doctrine, the Americans industrialized it. The art of the strike had turned into the science of projection. Technology defined both the glory and the downfall of Japan's carrier fleet. Early in the war, Japanese naval aviation was unmatched. The A-6M0 fighter ruled the skies, light, fast, and deadly in maneuver. Its engines purred with precision engineering, and its pilots flew as if welded to their machines. The Type 91 aerial torpedo could strike from low altitude with devastating accuracy. American torpedoes, by comparison, often malfunctioned. Japan's carriers themselves were technological marvels. Shokaku and Zuikaku combined speed with endurance. Their flight decks were longer, their hangars more efficient, their crews the most disciplined in the Pacific. Each launch felt like a ritual: order, clarity, coordination. But technology is never static. America's shipyards and laboratories moved faster. Within months of Pearl Harbor, radar-equipped ships began appearing across the Pacific. New Grumman F-6F Hellcats replaced the older Wildcats, offering armor, firepower, and range that dwarfed the Zero's agility. By 1943, Japan's advantage had evaporated. American carriers now operated with onboard radar, advanced communications, and improved damage control systems. A single US carrier could absorb punishment that would sink a Japanese vessel outright. Where Japan built elegance, America built endurance. Even in aircraft design, philosophy diverged. The Zero was a scalpel, lightweight, fragile, lethal in skilled hands. The Hellcat was a hammer, rugged, forgiving, and designed for mass production. The Zero required artisans, the Hellcat required assembly lines. Behind these machines lay the factories that defined the war's tempo. Mitsubishi could produce a few hundred Zeros a month. Grumman could produce hundreds of Hellcats every week. The war of technology was no longer about innovation. It was about replication. Behind the statistics and steel were human beings, thousands whose hands, sweat, and fear shaped the war's direction. In Japan, shipyards became temples of labor. Men worked 16-hour shifts in near silence. Food was scarce, materials scarcer. They knew every mistake could mean a pilot's death months later. The pride of the empire was built on exhaustion. For the aviators, the burden was spiritual. The Naval Air Service trained pilots to perfection, but at a cost the process took years. Every ace lost in combat was a national wound. By 1943, the ranks of veterans had thinned, replaced by recruits with only a fraction of the training hours. The cockpit became a coffin of loyalty. In America, the scene was different. Shipyards overflowed with workers from every corner of society. Women welded, riveted, and painted. Immigrants learned to read blueprints in a week. Paychecks replaced medals, shifts replaced parades. Yet their impact was no less heroic. Every aircraft carrier that slid into the Pacific was a monument to collective willpower. Names like Enterprise, Yorktown, and Hornet carried not just steel but the sweat of millions. For every Japanese pilot who took off from a sunlit deck, there were hundreds of unseen hands behind him. For every American ship launched, there were thousands of faces who never saw the ocean but built its empire nonetheless. War had turned the human race into an industrial organism, and as 1942 unfolded, both sides would discover that courage alone could not compete with the sheer mathematics of production. The next angles would reveal that war was no longer just about ships and pilots. It was about supply chains, leadership, and the moral weight of victory itself. By mid-1942, America's war machine had evolved into something the world had never seen before. An industrial organism feeding on steel, oil, and manpower. It did not build ships one at a time. It built them in swarms. Factories in California, Virginia, and New York operated like synchronized gears in a single engine. Car assembly plants became aircraft factories overnight. Conveyor belts that once carried consumer goods now moved fuselages, turbines, and propellers. The system was impersonal, efficient, and relentless. The Essex-class carrier embodied that transformation. Standardized blueprints meant a ship built in Norfolk was identical to one built in Tacoma. Every bolt, bracket, and beam could be swapped between vessels. Shipyards built modular sections separately and welded them together like a vast mechanical puzzle. Japan's shipwrights still worked by craft, wooden templates, hand riveting, meticulous supervision. America worked by scale. Every new ship required fewer days, fewer specialized hands. Between 1942 and 1945, the United States launched 17 fleet carriers and 9 light carriers, plus more than 100 escort carriers. No empire in history had ever built warships at that pace. Japan tried to adapt. It created emergency shipbuilding programs, simplified blueprints, and mobilized women into the workforce. But it was too late. Allied bombers began striking the very yards that Japan depended on. The same industrial complex that powered the Pearl Harbor fleet was now burning under American incendiaries. Industrial warfare had proven a truth older than strategy. Quantity becomes quality when it never stops arriving. Logistics determined the shape of the Pacific War. The ocean itself was the battlefield, a vast, moving front thousands of miles wide. To fight across it required fuel, food, spare parts, and constant repair. Japan could win battles, but it could not sustain them. Each major operation consumed irreplaceable fuel reserves and wore down air crews that had no replacements waiting. America treated logistics as a weapon. Oilers, ammunition ships, and repair tenders followed the carriers like shadows. Floating dry docks appeared on newly captured islands, allowing damaged vessels to return to battle within weeks instead of months. Behind the front lines stretched a network of depots from Pearl Harbor to Ulithi, a conveyor belt of war. Strategy became mathematics. The US Navy calculated sortie rates, fuel curves, and pilot attrition as if war were an equation. Japan, still guided by the spirit of decisive battle, never matched that cold precision. Admiral Chester Nimitz once summarized the new logic: train hard, fight easy, repair fast, return faster. Every victory fed back into the machine. The more the US fought, the more efficient it became. By 1944, Japan's fleet could not even reach the sea without running short of oil. America's could circle the globe and refuel on the way. The Pacific War had shifted from combat to consumption. Beneath the machinery, the numbers, and the doctrine lay a quieter tragedy. War on this scale consumed everything: metal, fuel, and people. Japan's workers collapsed from exhaustion. Rationing stripped cities of food and power. Families melted down pots for aircraft metal. In America, the home front bore its own strain: endless shifts, ration cards, telegrams of loss. Victory was not noble. It was mechanical. Every Japanese pilot knew that his skill would soon be outnumbered. Every American sailor understood that his enemy, though doomed, fought with desperate courage. The morality of survival blurred. In Japan, the sense of inevitability created a dark resolve. Pilots began volunteering for suicide missions, a reflection of national exhaustion disguised as sacrifice. Each kamikaze was not just an act of devotion, it was a symptom of industrial collapse. When a nation cannot replace machines, it sends men instead. In America, the moral burden came differently. The farther production accelerated, the less personal the war became. Numbers replaced names, reports tallied destroyed aircraft and sunken ships like factory quotas. The human cost faded behind statistics of efficiency. The Pacific became a factory floor, the sea its assembly line, and victory its product. Yet even amid that machinery, individual courage persisted. Sailors rescuing comrades from burning decks, mechanics rebuilding fighters overnight, nurses tending to the maimed. The system was vast, but humanity endured within it. As 1943 turned to 1944, both nations had reached their limits in different ways. Japan's precision had burned itself out. America's machinery was only accelerating. The contrast was now irreversible. The stage was set for the moment when numbers, strategy, and exhaustion would converge, the turning point that would decide the fate of the Pacific. The ocean was no longer an expanse between nations. It was the crucible where one empire would vanish and another would rise. June 1942. The sky over the Pacific shimmered with sunlight and tension. Below, two fleets searched for each other in a blue void that stretched beyond imagination. The Battle of Midway had begun, and with it, the moment that would divide the war in two. For Japan, this was supposed to be the decisive battle Yamamoto had envisioned, a strike to annihilate what remained of the American carrier force and force Washington to negotiate. The plan was elegant, audacious, and complex: lure the US fleet into a trap near Midway Atoll, destroy it, and seize control of the Central Pacific. The Kido Butai sailed with 4 carriers: Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, veterans of Pearl Harbor. Crews confident, disciplined, and certain of victory. Their flight decks gleamed under the morning sun. Every plane was armed, fueled, and ready. But war does not reward perfection, it rewards adaptability. Unknown to Yamamoto, American cryptographers had already broken portions of Japan's naval code. Admiral Chester Nimitz knew when and where the attack would come. Instead of walking into a trap, he set one. The US carriers Enterprise, Hornet, and the hastily repaired Yorktown waited northeast of Midway, silent, hidden beneath the horizon. At dawn on June 4th, Japanese aircraft struck Midway Island, turning its runways into burning craters. The first phase went exactly as planned, but as the strike group returned to refuel and rearm, Japan's carriers were caught in a deadly cycle. Decks crowded with fueled planes, bombs scattered across hangars, chaos replacing precision. Then came the moment. American dive bombers, arriving by luck and courage after hours of failed coordination, found the Japanese fleet exposed. In less than 5 minutes, 3 carriers, Akagi, Kaga, and Soryu, erupted in pillars of flame. Their decks vanished under rolling explosions. Thousands of Japanese sailors watched their navy's heart dissolve into black smoke. Hiryu fought back, striking Yorktown and damaging her severely, but by dusk she too was aflame, scuttled to prevent capture. 4 carriers, 4 symbols of Japan's naval supremacy gone in a single day. The loss was more than material. It shattered the psychological spine of the Imperial Navy. Japan had trained its pilots and crews for years. Now its finest aviators and deck officers were gone. Their replacements would never match their skill. For America, the cost was heavy but sustainable. One damaged carrier could be repaired, another built. Within months, Essex-class carriers began leaving their docks, filling the Pacific with new flight decks faster than Japan could count them. Midway was not simply a battle, it was a pivot. It marked the end of Japanese expansion and the beginning of American momentum. From that point forward, Japan fought from reaction, not initiative. Every new engagement, Guadalcanal, the Solomons, the Marianas, would drain its resources further. Admiral Yamamoto's grand design, the dream of decisive victory, had collapsed under the weight of industrial mathematics. The empire had built 6 carriers in 3 years, but now 4 lay on the ocean floor, and the factories that could replace them did not exist. Across the Pacific, American shipyards worked without pause. Men and women labored in rotating shifts, steel sparks flying into the night. The loss of 4 carriers meant new orders, not despair. Every ship destroyed meant another one commissioned. War had shifted from the realm of courage to the realm of capacity. As the flames of Midway dimmed, the Pacific itself seemed to tilt, the initiative sliding inexorably toward the industrial power rising in the east. Japan still possessed courage, experience, and naval pride, but the tide had turned. From now on, every Japanese victory would be temporary. Every American loss, replaceable. The empire that on. CE struck from the shadows, now braced for the storm it had awakened. The decisive battle had come, and it had ended not with triumph, but with the silence of burning steel. The next chapter would be no longer about who could win, but how long one side could endure before being erased by numbers. In shipyards stretching from San Francisco to Brooklyn, carriers rose from the ground like monuments to relentless production. The first, Essex-class carriers, Essex, Bunker Hill, Intrepid, Yorktown CV-10, slid into the water one after another, their decks gleaming under the floodlights. Workers did not celebrate, they simply moved to the next hull. The line never stopped. By the end of that year, the US Navy possessed more fleet carriers than Japan had built in its entire war effort. The equation had inverted. The hunter had become the hunted. Japan's remaining carriers, Shokaku, Zuikaku, Junyo, and a handful of smaller conversions, sailed with fewer planes, fewer trained aviators, and dwindling fuel. Every battle consumed men and material that could not be replaced. Every loss hollowed out the Imperial Navy's identity a little more. The war had entered its attrition phase, the phase Japan could never win. The Marianas Campaign of 1944 exposed the full force of America's industrial machine. Operation Forager, the invasion of Saipan, Tinian, and Guam brought more than 15 carriers under a single command. An armada so vast that Japanese reconnaissance initially mistook it for a fabrication. The fleet stretched across the horizon like a floating city. In June came the Battle of the Philippine Sea, what historians later called the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. Japanese pilots, many barely trained, launched in waves against radar-coordinated American defenses. The outcome was slaughter. More than 300 Japanese aircraft were destroyed in a single day. Entire squadrons vanished before reaching their targets. From the American carriers, the view was almost unreal. Blue sky filled with smoke trails, parachutes drifting like ashes, radio silence broken only by brief, stunned reports. Splash 1, splash 2. For Japan, this was more than defeat. It was disintegration. Its last generation of trained carrier aviators was gone. Its flight schools could not replace them. Its shipyards under constant air attack could no longer build replacements. Even the oil to train new pilots was running out. In contrast, the US Navy had perfected the rhythm of industrial warfare. Pilots trained in thousands, carriers repaired at sea, supply ships refueled fleets without ports. Every process refined, measured, repeated. The Pacific had become a machine that fed itself. When the Battle of Leyte Gulf erupted in October 1944, Japan's carrier fleet was already a shell of its former self. The once proud Zuikaku, last survivor of the Pearl Harbor strike group, sailed as bait. Her air groups were empty. Decoys meant to draw the American fleet north while other Japanese forces attacked from the south. It was a desperate act by an empire that had run out of time. Admiral Ozawa's decoy fleet was discovered and annihilated by American carrier groups that outnumbered and outgunned it beyond imagination. Zuikaku sank beneath the waves, her rising bow draped in white foam, the imperial flag still flying from her mast. With her went the last echo of Japan's carrier dream. In those same waters, the U.S. Navy's Task Force 38, commanded by Admiral Halsey, deployed nearly 1,500 aircraft. Carrier after carrier launched wave after wave with mechanical precision. Radar guided the strikes. Logistics kept them fueled. Factories thousands of miles away replaced every plane lost before the next operation began. It was warfare beyond the scale of any human emotion. By 1945, the numbers told the story more brutally than any battle could. Japan, 6 fleet carriers built between 1939 and 1942. America, 17 fleet carriers and countless escort carriers by 1944, and still be yielding. Every American victory added momentum. Every Japanese defeat accelerated collapse. Japan's leaders understood the truth long before the final bombs fell. The empire that had once defined modern naval aviation was being erased not by strategy, but by output. The Industrial War had rendered tactics almost irrelevant. The US Navy could lose ships, pilots, even fleets, and rebuild them faster than Japan could write the casualty lists. As the war entered its final year, Japan's shipyards stood silent under ruins, the torches had gone cold, the hammers no longer struck. The empire that built 6 carriers in 3 years could now build none. Meanwhile, American carriers filled the horizon like steel islands, each one a city of war, thousands of men, hundreds of aircraft, endless supply lines trailing across the Pacific. The balance had become absolute. Japan's defeat was not sealed by any single battle, but by 1,000 blueprints, 1,000,000 hands and an industrial rhythm that never stopped. From Midway's flames to the ruins of Kure, the Pacific's story had turned from glory to inevitability. The age of the Imperial Japanese Navy was over. The age of American naval supremacy had begun. When the guns finally fell silent in 1945, Japan's once glorious navy lay beneath the waves. The Kido Butai, that symbol of precision and pride, existed only in memory and photographs. The steel that had once embodied the empire's reach now rested at the bottom of the Pacific, twisted and rusting in the cold. The defeat had not come suddenly. It was the slow suffocation of a nation that had waged a modern war with pre-industrial limits. By 1944, Japan's shipyards were shadows of their former selves, bombed, starved of fuel, stripped of raw materials. Each day of survival demanded sacrifices deeper than the day before. At Kure, Yokosuka, and Nagasaki, burned-out hulls lined the harbors. The skeletal remains of half-built carriers, Akagi, Hiryu, Taiho's successors, stood like tombstones to an ambition that had outrun its means. Even if the war had continued another year, Japan could not have launched another fleet. In Tokyo, naval staff officers sifted through casualty lists that stretched into columns of names. The lost pilots of Midway, the drowned crews of Zuikaku and Shokaku, the vanished squadrons of the Marianas. The war that began with 6 proud carriers ended with none. Meanwhile, across the ocean, the American Navy had reached a scale no empire in history had ever imagined. By the summer of 1945, over 100 aircraft carriers of every class patrolled the Pacific, fleet, light, and escort. Some carried jet prototypes. Others launched strikes from waters Japan once considered unreachable. The US no longer measured its power in ships, but in systems, supply routes, refueling fleets, floating hospitals, mobile repair bases. The Pacific had become an American domain not through conquest alone, but through organization. When Japan surrendered on August 15th, the surviving carrier Akagi lay capsized in Kure harbor. Her flight deck, once the pride of naval architects, was crushed against the mud. Nearby, wrecked cruisers and battleships stood half-submerged, silent reminders of what had been lost. For the sailors who survived, the sight was unbearable. Men who had launched the attack on Pearl Harbor returned to find their cities burned, their navy annihilated, their emperor announcing surrender over a static-filled radio. The sound of his voice marked the end of centuries of martial tradition. Yet within the ruins a strange calm settled. The war that had consumed everything, industry, faith, and youth, was over. The hammers had gone quiet, the furnaces had cooled. In America, shipyards celebrated in silence. Victory felt inevitable but not joyous. The men and women who had built the floating cities of war returned home to empty factories and quiet streets. The same industrial engine that had defeated Japan would soon slow. Its purpose complete. The contrast between the two nations was absolute. One had exhausted its spirit in pursuit of perfection, the other had discovered power through imperfection multiplied. Japan's naval dream, born of precision and pride, had been erased by a simple truth. Wars are not won by brilliance alone, but by the capacity to keep building after brilliance fails. The empire that began with 6 carriers had been consumed by a nation that built 17. Then kept going until it no longer mattered how many. The sea, once ruled by craftsmanship, now belonged to the machine. The next phase of the story was no longer about battles or construction, but about what remained, a reckoning of loss, memory, and transformation. When the Allied occupation began, the remains of Japan's navy were methodically dismantled. Warships that had once carried the rising sun were stripped of guns, engines, and names. Metal scavengers cut through hulls with acetylene torches, melting history into raw steel for civilian reconstruction. The sound of grinding metal replaced the thunder of engines, an empire being disassembled piece by piece. American officers toured the ruined naval bases, documenting the wreckage. What they saw confirmed what wartime analysts had already concluded. Japan's defeat had been written in tonnage. Its factories could never rival the mass production of the American heartland. At its peak, Japan had built 6 full-sized carriers across 3 years, each one a masterpiece of craftsmanship. But across the ocean, the United States had built 17 in the same span, followed by dozens more. The industrial asymmetry had been total. Every Japanese shipyard struggled with shortages: copper, aluminum, aviation fuel, and even labor. Allied blockades cut supply lines from Manchuria and Southeast Asia, leaving shipbuilders with empty warehouses. While American yards built ships on assembly lines, Japan's builders still relied on handcraft and custom fitting. Precision was their pride, but it became their weakness. The Imperial Navy's final carrier, Shinano, symbolized the contradiction. Converted from the hull of a super battleship, she was the largest carrier ever launched by Japan. Massive, heavily armored, and fatally rushed. In November 1944, only 10 days after leaving the dock, she was sunk by the American submarine USS Archerfish with 4 torpedoes. A 100 million warship lost before it fired a shot. That sinking captured the end of an era. No longer could engineering brilliance compensate for strategic blindness. Japan's naval power had become a monument to wasted excellence. Meanwhile, in American naval archives, planners reviewed the numbers with clinical detachment. The Essex-class program had produced carriers faster than they could be crewed. Training squadrons overflowed with new pilots. Air groups rotated between ships without pause. The ratio of production was not just numerical, it was existential. Japan could no longer define the rhythm of war. America defined its tempo, its logistics, and even its pace of replacement. When the peace treaty was signed in 1951, Japan's war industries were forbidden from producing offensive weapons. The shipyards that once built carriers began constructing merchant vessels and tankers. Their designers turned from armor plating to cargo holds, from flight decks to passenger decks. The same craftsmanship that once served destruction now fueled recovery. By the 1960s, the rebuilt Japanese shipyards had become the most efficient in the world, not for war, but for commerce. The ghost of the Kido Butai lingered only in steel blueprints and naval museums. Historians would later call it the industrial inversion, the transformation of Japan's shipbuilding genius from a military pursuit into a peaceful one. Where once stood the roar of engines and carrier launches, now stood cranes and shipping containers, symbols of trade instead of conquest. Yet even in peace, the lesson. The carriers remained clear. Japan's defeat was not simply the story of lost battles. It was the story of industrial mathematics overpowering martial philosophy. The Empire had built 6 masterpieces. The United States had built 17 machines, and then kept going until the outcome ceased to depend on courage or skill. The sea, once ruled by sailors, had been claimed by factories. In the quiet aftermath, one truth endured: technology without production is brilliance without endurance. And endurance, not brilliance, had won the Pacific War. The story of the carriers, those 6 proud decks of the rising sun, had ended beneath the waves. But their legacy endured, not in victory or defeat, but as the clearest expression of what modern war had become, a contest not of men, but of nations measured in steel, oil, and time. The Pacific War ended not with a single explosion, but with a realization that power in the modern age no longer belonged to the warrior, it belonged to the builder. The story of Japan's 6 carriers and America's 17 is the story of 2 civilizations colliding across an ocean, one driven by mastery, the other by scale. Japan's carriers were art, handcrafted machines of precision, forged by men who believed perfection could win wars. America's carriers were systems, born from assembly lines, interchangeable, relentless, infinite. Both nations fought with courage, but courage alone could not outlast the mathematics of industrial war. At Midway, Japan lost its elite. In the Marianas, it lost its sky. At Leyte Gulf, it lost its sea. And by 1945, it had lost the very capacity to continue the fight. Every pilot lost was irreplaceable. Every carrier sunk was a wound that could not heal. The United States, by contrast, grew stronger the longer it fought. Each loss was absorbed, each setback answered with new construction. Where Japan saw tragedy, America saw production schedules. In the end, it wasn't strategy that decided the war. It was endurance. The ruins of Akagi, Kaga, and Hiryu still rest beneath the Pacific, silent monuments to the age of handcrafted war. They remind us that brilliance, pride, and discipline are not enough when confronted by the raw scale of mechanized industry. Modern warfare became, from that moment onward, a contest of nations capable of replacing what they lost, faster than the enemy could destroy it. In this truth lies the enduring lesson of the Pacific. The measure of power is not in the number of victories won, but in the ability to continue fighting when all victories seem out of reach. Japan built 6 carriers in 3 years. America built 17, and then stopped counting. The outcome was not fate, it was arithmetic.